So let's talk about the mindset shift that we'll have to have when transitioning from old school visual effects to real-time visual effects inside of Unreal Engine. And the first rule here is that we're learning a game engine first. Unreal is a game engine first, and we're going to approach it that way. You can't avoid learning the game engine side of Unreal. If you do ignore this, troubleshooting becomes really, really difficult and frustrating because you're unsure of how to proceed because you just never learned the game development side of Unreal. And this is why the learning curve is so steep. But the good news is we're going to keep it insanely simple and easy to understand. I think a lot of people overcomplicate these ideas. So we'll introduce you to blueprints in a really simple way. And we'll even create our own simple game within the first few chapters so we can understand the game engine side first and then start to learn how to use this for visual effects. The next lesson is focus on learning one system at a time. There's many different systems for effects, materials, and animation, and people have careers focusing on just one of these disciplines, but I'll break them down into simple modules. We'll start with navigation, so we understand the outliner, the viewport. There's a separate system for lighting, where you'll need a directional light, a skylight, and exponential height fog if you want to create exterior lighting. We also have the material graph, which is a node-based graph to create materials inside of Unreal. And Unreal has a specific system for master materials and material instances, which we'll talk about in just a bit. And then lastly, blueprints, which is a way for us to bundle different objects together into a group. And blueprints can send and receive data using simple math and programming logic to trigger different events. Don't worry about this one. We'll walk you through it in just a few lessons. And then later on, towards the second half of this course, we'll get into our skeletal mesh editor, which is the homepage for our characters. We'll get into Niagara so we can create particles and dynamic effects for our scene. And then we'll use Sequencer and Movie Render Queue to create our films. So Sequencer is our timeline where we can add in actors and create animation. And then we'll use Movie Render Queue as our render farm to export our timelines. This does sound like a lot, don't get me wrong, but Unreal is at its best when all of these systems are interacting together, which is why we're going to start very simple and basic at first and build our way up so that by the end of the course, we have a full understanding of how each one of these modules works together and feeds into Sequencer and Movie Render Queue so we can render it out. And let's be honest, Unreal Engine is complicated, so that's why my goal is to just focus on the few things that matter for visual effects and filmmaking. Lesson 3 is that VFX is slow, but your creativity is happening in real time. What I mean by this is old school rendering is slow. It takes such a long time to get your renders back, especially when you're trying to render out sequences, let alone just a still frame. It is so slow and there's so much waiting around. But when we're in real time, we can try out ideas and it doesn't take a lot of time. Path tracing is not real time. Compositing is not real time. These are old school VFX techniques, and you can totally use these systems and lean on these systems to get a good result. But I have just found that it is so much faster to work real time. So that's why my preferred workflow is just to get the correct image all inside of Unreal Engine. Don't try to think about how can I fix this later after it's rendered. Think about how can I fix the scene I have in front of me right now. Because Unreal Engine is real time, it's always going to be faster to make those changes in Unreal. So we're going to replace our render times with education. So we only have to learn how Unreal Engine works once, and then we can get rid of all of these slow render times and just focus on how to make our renders look as amazing as possible. Lesson number 4 is don't waste time modeling. There's already enough to be learning without learning a modeling software on top of this. So if you need assets, get them from the marketplace or Quixel Megascans for now. And later on, I'll show you how to use the modeling tools so that you can create your own assets entirely within Unreal Engine. Lesson number 5 is follow the fun. If something is getting you stuck and it's completely not working, rather than going insane and falling down that rabbit hole for a week or 2 weeks, sometimes just drop it. Follow the more fun parts of the project so you don't get stuck in the troubleshooting side of Unreal, because it can happen to any of us. If you're getting stuck, use our Smart Search feature where you can search through this entire video library using the captions and jump directly into that time code. Otherwise, ask for help on the Unreal Engine forums or in our Discord. Lesson number 6 is the importance of scale. So what do I mean by this? This is more of a visual effects concept, but I find that the biggest difference between amateur and professional work is having a very clear sense of scale. So when trying to go for photorealism, like they were doing in this Unreal 5 demo, the scale of every single object in this scene matches what it would look like in real life. Whereas beginners' work can sometimes lack that sense of realism, And the most common reason why is that we've pushed our assets and scaled them up or scaled them down too much so that none of the objects are actually the correct size inside of our scene. So if you're ever thinking, why does my environment not look correct? Every object in your scene has to have the correct scale to look realistic. That means the scale of the geometry and the detail of the geometry, the scale of the textures, and the overall blockout of the environment. If you're creating a city street, is it the exact width and length as a real life city street? The best way to check for this is to use reference images, use human stand-ins in your scene, and just start measuring the size of things in 3D and in real life. A single unit in Unreal is 1 centimeter in real life. That's the conversion. But in an image like this, we have that human scale reference, so we know exactly how big this scene should be. Our grass has a lot of variation, where some of it's very large and some of it's really, really small. And then the scale and size of our textures is uniform across our entire scene. Nothing's low resolution or stretching. And this statue in the back looks huge because of the texture scale and the size of the tiling of these bricks. Features like this ground a very large object like this in reality by making the textures a more photorealistic size. Now let's talk about documentation, because a lot of people have mixed opinions on the documentation for Unreal. It can be very tricky because there's a lot of old documentation from the previous versions of Unreal, and it can be really hard to navigate. A lot of times there's completely outdated information that just doesn't apply. Sometimes the articles are too complex and not really teaching you what you're looking for. And it's nice that there's a lot of sample projects out there, but in the documentation, there is definitely a lack of practical examples when walking through the more complex systems in Unreal. So this is how to actually use documentation so you can find exactly what you need when troubleshooting. And that's to ask yourself, are you looking for a workflow or a feature? Now, a workflow is how the different systems in Unreal work together. You'll want to find a page about the workflow first, and then after you know how the different systems work together, then start to zoom in to each feature or each plugin. So for example, this is the workflow page for lighting. So here we can see how all of the different features work together, but we could go inside of any one of these features like Lumen. And from here, now we can see the exact menus and buttons to press to change our settings once we know how all of the systems work together. So the hotkey, you can just press F11 if you're inside an editor like your Material Graph. You can just press F11 and the documentation will pop up for this editor. And a really good tip, write this down if you can. Press Control and Alt and just drag over every single detail and every single node so you can find explanations for these different editors, and you'll find that there's advanced tooltips hidden in Unreal. And this is the single thing that helped me learn Unreal a lot faster. And the last lesson is to start and finish small projects. This is the best way to practice, is not to be too precious about any one project. When you're first learning Unreal, it's not enough to just watch tutorials. You actually have to apply this information to make sure it really works inside of Unreal. It's one thing for all of these things to make sense conceptually, but it's another thing to have them working correctly once you go to render your final image. One of my favorite stories is of the 2 students who have 30 days to make the best clay pot in their class. Now, which one do you think had a better result? The student who spent 30 days working on one pot over that entire month, or the student who made a new pot every single day, and after 30 days, they've created 30 pots from scratch? This is the approach we have to take with Unreal Engine. We have to make 30 small projects to really make sure that we know and apply all of these small techniques before we go ahead and make our masterpiece films, because we don't want to get tripped up in the middle of production. And we'll be practicing together by recreating environments from some of my favorite Hollywood films. So the first one will be The Dark Knight, where we'll get our bearings and start to build our first environment, understand how decals work, use a human scale reference, and we'll actually build the entire ceiling using a blueprint to get a nice introduction into blueprints. From there, we're going to create a really simple game. That way we know exactly how the game engine side of Unreal works, so we know what we need to focus on when just trying to create visual effects in films. And then we'll start creating environments with characters. So we've got this still from Raya and the Last Dragon, and we'll build this entire environment from scratch and even add in characters and start creating animation all inside of this scene. And this will be a first introduction to the effects like the torches and the magic orb. We'll also create some landscapes and show you how to use exponential height fog to create some really interesting looks for exterior environments. And for our final project, we're going to recreate this environment from Raya and the Last Dragon, completely from scratch inside of Unreal, lighting, Niagara particle effects, using Megascans and creating assets of our own. and do our final composite in Nuke, and that way we can learn all of the best practices for visual effects, filmmaking, and virtual production. So I hope you're ready to dive into Unreal, open up the project files that have been included with this course, and we'll get started in the next lesson.